Author, Mariann Uehlinger, Switzerland. Translation, Bruce Lulla in USA and Mariann Uehlinger in Switzerland. Source FIGU Bulletin, 101 on page 29.
The outcoming effects of the might, greed and rapacity of the ultra-rich by the machinations of the International Monetary Fund, IMF. Human being, study the spiritual teaching and unite as a spiritual teaching people to become the opposite pole.
The saying,
"The hand that gives is always above the hand that takes,"
is said to come from Napoleon. To put it somewhat more blatantly and honestly, the money giver stands always above the money receiver. This is a very plastic representation, especially when it is still considered that the giver can choose the recipient and the quantity of what the recipient gets. Those at the very top never give, really never, just for the heck of it, because they are supposedly nice human beings. They always demand a multiple of everything back, even from those who have previously received nothing at all. In that case, those are the so-called savings plan bail persons. Bail persons are savers, small shareholders, taxpayers, small homeowners, retirees, the poor, the sick and disadvantaged children, etc., who, in the disaster caused by the IMF, were not involved. Simply everyone except those at the top, the so-called financial elite. At the latest, when the guarantee, bailout, which has never been accepted by the people, is due, the phrase,
"The hand that gives is always above the hand that takes,"
no longer applies, since no matter how the e-bail persons are exempted, how they bleed and suffer, they merely pay, often with their lives. They are never the ones above. This is an unwritten law, that the mightful ones of finance, those at the very top, the escargot users of the system, of neoliberalism, arrogate to themselves. They always demand a multiple of everything back, even from those who have previously received nothing at all. In that case, those are the so-called savings plan bail persons. Bail persons are savers, small shareholders, taxpayers, small homeowners, retirees, the poor, the sick and disadvantaged children, etc., who, in the disaster caused by the IMF, were not involved. Simply everyone except those at the top, the so-called financial elite. At the latest, when the guarantee, bailout, which has never been accepted by the people, is due, the phrase,
"The hand that gives is always above the hand that takes,"
no longer applies, since no matter how the e-bail persons are exempted, how they bleed and suffer, they merely pay, often with their lives. They are never the ones above. This is an unwritten law, that the mightful ones of finance, those at the very top, the escargot users of the system, of neoliberalism, arrogate to themselves. Despite information suppression by the USA-friendly or even USA-subservient mainstream and tabloid media and their mendacious campaigns, more and more critical voices from all sides are heard over the internet and also in books, who bring to light the heinous doings and activities of criminal states and business leaders as well as religious and sect bigwigs, and make such accusations public. Above all, FIGU. In contrast to the journalists of the mainstream and the tabloid press, who derive their goods of thought from a U.S. press agency based in Germany and copy each other without thinking, the journalists of the critical voice investigate independently and often for years or decades, as the journalist and author Ernst Wolff has done for his book Pillaging the World, The History and Politics of the IMF. Whoever wants to understand what terrible things are going on around the world should read this book. These videos are a good introduction to it. Ernst Wolff does not describe something like a brain delusion or creates fantasized conspiracy theories. No, it's about brutal reality. However, before going into individual statements made in the book Pillaging the World, The History and Politics of the IMF, several sentences concerning the outcoming effects of economic might and economic robbery in supportive of Wolff shall be quoted in advance from the Predictions and Prophecies of Billy Edward Albert Meyer, also called Beam. Beam wrote the 162
sentences in the middle of the 20th century and sent them out to all governments of Europe. Manuel also commented on the coming modern era, Age of Aquarius, that is modern era starting from 1844. which can be read in the book Talmage Manual by Judas Iskarioth.
The fact that the written to governments did not react to the warnings of Beam is to be recognized today and also will be in the future by the desolate state of our earth and the ailing mass of the humankind of earth.
Predictions and Prophecies 1951 and 1958 by Billy Edward Albert Meyer, Beam.
36. Also the simple human being himself, herself, as well as the rich, will only see her mammon, count it, and strive for wealth, luxury, enjoyments and holidays, while the authorities and the administrative bodies will exploit the citizen with all kinds of new excises and taxes. 37. In the third millennium, the Moloch mammon will bring forth very much worse blooms than in the 20th century, because the immorality and the felony as well as white-collar criminality and warmongery and so on, will no longer recognize any boundaries when it comes to hoarding mammon. 38. Criminal business leaders will feather their nests with million-dollar payments and million-dollar golden handshakes and engage in maladministration and thereby drive quite traditional companies to ruin, as also the citizens will privately go bankrupt when they can no longer control their finances, because they are driven away from reliable money and are equipped with plastic money in the form of plastic cards, with which they live beyond their means, pay for all kinds of things on credit, and get into horrendous debt, whereby also special companies come into existence for the administration of plastic cards, while the banks will be in on making their customers dependent with plastic cards which will then be called credit cards, whereby they quite particularly have their eye set on the youth, who thereby pile up immense mountains of debt which drives them into need and misery. Voice 1 Ivana 2 Nicole.
39. The fire of maladministration spreads itself constantly, also in the inept governments which, likewise engaging in maladministration, manage their own countries into ruin when they accrue such immense debts that they rise in such a form that the country must be declared bankrupt.
40. And it will be that even before the time of the third millennium, and indeed in 1993, a political and commercial European dictatorship will arise that will be called their
European Union,
and, in evil, will bear the number 666. Because through it the citizens of all member countries will ultimately be brought under total control through biometric data in identification devices and in the form of small data chips in the head or body inserted in a
biometric identification system
that will be overseen and controlled through a
central data bank,
whereby finally the whereabouts of every human being can be exactly determined to the meter. First the USA and later the European Union will introduce this modern human enslavement, after which other countries will also follow, with Switzerland leading the way, whereby, through this process, the personal and national citizens' human rights will be drastically cut back, which fundamentally will be already planned at the construction of the European Union, whereby the citizen is finally incapacitated, and is to be governed only by the authorities, without having a right to a say regarding any government things and decisions. 90. Worldwide, hate will increasingly spread and the state's mighty ones' greed for might will no longer know any boundaries. Consequently, they will pass bad laws to torment the citizens and from which nobody will be spared, neither the elderly, nor the young human beings, nor the children. 96. The better positioned human being of the prosperous countries sleeps on bags full of money, and what he or she gives with one hand he or she takes away again with the other, whereby those needing help neither live nor die, rather can only vegetate on misery. 97. The human being plies trade with everything that comes into her hands and, as a result, everything has its price, even the water that is our common planetary possession, and everything will be sold and nothing more given. Consequently, every gift demands a gift in return. 136. In the third millennium many human beings will hear of the old prophecies and predictions, of the proverbs of the prophets and the warnings of the wise, which have been handed down since ancient times, and they will thirst for retribution, and provoke the time in which the people stand up and call for the truth. 137. However, before the people call for the truth, they will go astray in an impenetrable labyrinth in which great anxiety and suspicion exist, and the human being will be restlessly driven forward in order to find a way out of the misery and all the need. 138. The truth of the creation and its laws and recommendations, as well as the spiritual teaching and teachings of the life, will be spread loud and strong and worldwide, yet the earth human being does not want to hear them, because only few, who have rationality and intelligence, will turn to the great teachings, while all the others want to possess more and more, and cling to phantasms which they have concocted in their heads, spurred on by bad and false prophets in religious and sectarian matters.
What must be made known comprehensively in a prophetic and predictive wise for the third millennium.
Extract from Goblet of the Truth by Billy Beam.
In future time, it will be the case that very many of you human beings of Earth will think yourselves as creation itself, in your religious, sectarian sense as God. The powerful ones of all kinds amongst you will seize ever more land and property and other belongings for themselves, including women, whom they will keep as prostitutes or as objects of prestige. Whereas the powerful ones amongst you will increasingly view the poor and weak as subhuman and as vermin, and will treat them accordingly, so that you who belong to this class will increasingly live in fear and the hatred in you will assume its most poisonous forms. However, all the items named here only represent the start, because in secret there is a mighty organization of the governing class and the mightful ones as well as many of their obedient lackeys emerging from amongst your humanity, who are creating a secret order of darkness with their own evil laws and ordinances, who are bent on hatred for the poor and weak and against the economically imprisoned all normal citizens. And it is their desire to seize ever more might, more money and entire mastery over the whole earth and your humanity for themselves. Therefore it is spreading their evil supremacy over the world, supported by its obedient vassals of all kinds who are greedy for blood as well as profit. Even the powerful ones of the economy are feeling the might and obeying the evil laws of the Dark Order, which is spreading its dangerous and fatal poison of hatred everywhere, into everything and against everyone who does not share the same opinion as the Dark Might. Therefore, you human beings of Earth are no longer active to any great extent, but go along in idleness with an empty expression in your eyes, knowing not what you should do and where you should go, because you have nothing else to do that brings you joy and a good reward. And you human beings of Earth, both young and old, are the ones who can no longer set down any roots in your life. You wander, demoralized and hopeless, bereft of work and home, with the result that you fight yourselves in all things and you hate your present existence, to the extent of finally bringing it to an end yourselves, as has already been the case to an increasing extent since the 20th century and will become ever more widespread in future. Therefore, with the third millennium, this time has already dawned in which these things have quickly found their beginning and will develop ever more rapidly the longer they persist. As a result, the number of diseases and plagues is increasing, as is the number of illnesses that severely impair drinking water and bodies of water because of poisons of various kinds, as well as the air, soil and foodstuffs which grow on trees and bushes as well as in fields, woods, gardens and greenhouses. And still your efforts to counteract all the disasters are in vain, as are your attempts to put a brake on this development, because it is becoming greater and more catastrophic with every day, indeed with every hour and every minute, standing in relation to the rapid increase in overpopulation. Not later than since the so-called Greek crisis, the IMF, the EU and the ECP have also become known in Europe under the name Troika. Ernst Wolff even dedicates a whole chapter to Greece under the title, Greece and the Troika, Bringing Hunger Back to Europe. Who is exactly behind the IMF and which intentions are followed, this is either unknown to most human beings or presented in the Western press in a deliberately downplaying and misleading wise as a great help for a country. Ernst Wolff clarifies mercilessly. The machinations of the IMF are extremely malicious. The human being is not supposed to develop in terms of consciousness and to gain in discernment, but to mutate more or less to illiterates. Ability to think, independence and knowledge are obstacles on the road to exploitation. Only doggish belief in the authorities of religious or worldly nature fills the moneybags of the oligarchs on a large scale. An economic magnate or tycoon who, by dint of his/her wealth, exerts extensive might over a country or region solely to his/her own advantage. even if the author dedicates his book to those people who cannot read it by saying, "This book is dedicated to those people in Africa, Asia and South America who cannot read it because the politics of the IMF have denied them the right to education," it is not necessarily meant in this sense. Ernst Wolff only wants to say thereby that the International Monetary Fund specifically affects the poorest of the poor, because children of rich parents never have problems to attend a good school, even if it is abroad.
The IMF is a financial organization. What is its mission and how does it perform it?
Officially, the IMF's main task consists in stabilizing the global financial system and helping out troubled countries in times of crisis. In reality, its operations are more reminiscent of warring armies. Wherever it intervenes, it undermines the sovereignty of states by forcing them to implement measures that are rejected by the majority of the population, thus leaving behind a broad trail of economic and social devastation. In pursuing its objectives, the IMF never resorts to the use of weapons or soldiers. It simply applies the mechanisms of capitalism, specifically those of credit. Its strategy is as simple as it is effective. When a country runs into financial difficulties, the IMF steps in and provides support in the form of loans. In return, it demands the enforcement of measures that serve to ensure the country's solvency in order to enable it to repay these loans.
How does the IMF proceed with the allocation of loans?
Because of its global status as lender of last resort, governments usually have no choice but to accept the IMF's offer and submit to its terms, thus getting caught in a web of debt, which they, as a result of interest, compound interest and principal, get deeper and deeper entangled in. The resulting strain on the state budget and the domestic economy inevitably leads to a deterioration of their financial situation, which the IMF in turn uses as a pretext for demanding ever new concessions in the form of austerity programs. Austerity, from Latin, austeritas, meaning sternness, harshness, finds in the economic sense use as a term for a strict policy of the state because there are bad economic conditions.
What are, for example, the demands, austerity programs, of the IMF on the country in return for its aid program?
Extract, reduced, from book, page 144.
Cancellation of jobs in the public service, reduction of starting wages in the civil service, reduction of social benefits for large families, for example decreasing the child allowance, reduction of social benefits for the unemployed, raising of the wage tax, reduction of the health budget, freezing pensions in the public sector and its progressive reduction, a gradual increase of the retirement age, abolition of tax relief for private pension provision, an increase in taxation on cars, alcohol and tobacco, raising of value-added tax, VAT, introduction of a property tax, loosening of regulations allowing financially troubled companies to withhold or only partially pay wages, lowering of the minimum wage, etc.
What consequences do these policies of the IMF have on the population?
The consequences are disastrous for the ordinary people of the countries affected, which are mostly low income, because their governments all follow the same pattern, passing the effects of austerity on to wage earners and the poor. In this manner, IMF programs have cost millions of people their jobs, denied them access to adequate health care, functioning educational systems and decent housing. They have rendered their food unaffordable, increased homelessness, robbed old people of the fruits of lifelong work, favored the spread of diseases, reduced life expectancy and increased infant mortality.
Who are the profiteers of this policy?
At the other end of the social scale, however, the policies of the IMF have helped a tiny layer of ultra-rich increase their vast fortunes even in times of crisis. Its measures have contributed decisively to the fact that global inequality has assumed historically unprecedented levels. The income difference between a sun king and a beggar at the end of the Middle Ages pales compared to the difference between a hedge fund manager and a social welfare recipient of today. Explanation from Wikipedia. A hedge fund is an investment fund that pools capital from accredited individuals or institutional investors and invests in a variety of assets, often with complex portfolio construction and risk management techniques, etc., who precisely profits from the activities of the IMF. Is also subject matter of the extremely fluidly and well-written, but also oppressive book. Anyone who reads it finds out that behind the IMF is a small group of money-greedy, ultra-rich men and women, who mercilessly enrich themselves through dishonest machinations. Such persons, who do not have much in common with the being human in the real and true sense, their felonies as well as the procedure are always of the same kind, only their battle scenes change. At the beginning, the IMF was mainly active in Africa, Asia and South America, but then, in the aftermath of the outbreak of the financial crisis in 2007, the IMF has increasingly turned its attention to Northern Europe, and since the onset of the euro crisis in 2009, the focus has mainly been on Southern Europe. The Cypriots and Greeks are already suffering enormously. The Spaniards, Italians, Portuguese and perhaps also the French will be next. Ernst Wolff does not often mention Switzerland. When he does, then it is in a slightly bitter mocking tone in connection with the too big to fail of the banks. Perhaps it also tells disappointment of the fact that not even where democracy is supposed to prevail, do the voters refuse to accept such impertinences, but rather they faithfully swallow the false propaganda. While reading the following two sentences, who does not immediately think about our overly solicitous ex-federal councillor Uehlinger Schlumpf, and her people's backstabbing vassals, who also want to slimily betray us Swiss to the EU, who at that time was responsible for the finances department. Page 127, hundreds of billions of dollars changed hands. In the US, market giants such as real estate financiers Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae and insurer AIG were taken over by the state. Their owners thus spared huge losses. In Switzerland, the bank UBS, which had posted a profit of 5.6 billion Swiss francs in the second quarter of 2007 alone, received a government infusion of almost 60 billion Swiss
francs overnight, without prior discussion in Parliament and without any parties or unions taking to the streets in protest afterwards, in a country that boasts of its direct democracy through plebiscites. Page 177, Switzerland, seen as a pioneer in matters of financial regulation in Europe, acted without delay.
On September 1, 2011, the Swiss Financial Market Supervisory Authority, FINMA, announced
revised reorganization provisions
of the Swiss Banking Act which regulate their
conversion of deposits into new equity capital to maintain systemically important functions in the event of a crisis,
thus laying new legal foundations providing that to rescue ailing banks, recourse is to be taken to the assets of small shareholders and savers instead of turning to the state for help. Unfortunately, there is also a lot of smoke and mirrors in Switzerland. The old Swiss Confederates would be turning in their grave, if they could follow how their hard-won freedom from foreign servitude is given away to the USA and the EU dictatorship out of might greed, money greed and horrendous foolishness. At the end of his preface, Ernst Wolff asks the following: why? How can it be that an organization that causes such immense human suffering around the globe continues to act with impunity and with the backing of the most powerful forces of our time? In whose interest does the IMF work? Who benefits from its actions? In this highly gripping and at the same time shaking book, Wolff himself gives not only the answers to these aforementioned questions, but he also mentions the string pullers and how the whole process is handled. Dear readers, if up to now, you have thought that behind the ridiculous term think tank righteous scientists would stand, who devise strategies for the purpose of national well-being, then you are wrong, because it mostly concerns highly paid, studied vassals and stooges, who, for the string pullers, thus the high finance, work out lousy and inhuman exploitation strategies comparable to Nazi strategies. The fact that the idea for the IMF has arisen from US American brains is not further surprising. There is almost no infamous action on this earth, in which the US Americans have not had their fingers in the pie and continue to. In many contact reports, FIGU bulletins, FIGU special bulletins, Zeichen, etc., and also in the article Why the United States of America, the USA, are what they are, all once suffering from a belief delusion insanity, always suffering from a belief delusion insanity? Published, in German only, in FIGU Special Bulletin number 96, reasons are explained which have led to and continue to lead to these US-American Aushungerungen and felonies, for which reason a re-mentioning of all this is dispensed with. And even though the horrendous overpopulation, the religions and the boundlessly low intelligence of the human beings of Earth inevitably implies their downfall. This time attention should be directed to a potential solution which Ernst Wolff also brings up in the last section of the chapter Mountains of Debt, Social Inequality, Revolution, ringing in the end of the IMF. He writes among other things the following, page 198, in the event that working people, against all odds, one day manage to see clearly through the haze of lies incessantly spouted by the media and politicians, release themselves from the strangling grip to the established parties and organizations, and use the coming confrontations to develop new and contemporary forms of struggle and organization, then they will be able to seize a historic opportunity to create a new social order on the basis of the most advanced forms of technology and science, which will no longer serve to satisfy the boundless greed of a minority, but the social needs of the majority. What exactly such a society will look like, only the future will reveal. But one thing can be said for certain, organizations such as the IMF will have no place in it. A new society? Exactly, that is the solution, and Quetzal already spoke about this at the 150th official contact of October 10, 1981, Pleiadian Pledger and Contact Reports, Block 4. Pages 230-231, sentences 86,103, as he commented with the following words on this social order or new society mentioned by Ernst Wolff in 2014, with the exception that Quetzal doesn't talk about a society, but a people.
With the irrational craziness of the human beings of Earth, however, this cannot be the case, because they will not let themselves be instructed.
With this, however, the humankind of Earth drives itself into an abyss without hope of rescue. However, the human beings of Earth shall not die out and be eliminated, which is why suitable measures must be taken.
And what should these measures then look like?
As irrational as it sounds with the cognizances about the terrestrial overpopulation, a new people must be founded. Which, however, must be a people that lives in accordance with the natural creational laws, through which they will become an ideal for the great mass of the humankind of Earth made stupid and has an instructive effect on them. However, I will provide you with more detailed information about this at a later date, in connection with other concerns that relate to your group.
On Wednesday, the 30th of January, 2016, on the occasion of the 642nd official contact, Te explained what this people mentioned by Quetzal is all about.
If the talk was of a new people, then Quetzal spoke in the sense of a people, according to how Nicodemian in such a wise formed a people, by striving, in a planets-wide mode, to teach the human beings with regard to the teaching of the truth, teaching of the spirit, teaching of the life. So it happened, that planets-wide a great many human beings followed Nicodemian, but remained in their homelands and learned, simply the spiritual teaching. In this wise they formed a planets-wide spiritual teaching people, as it was called by Nicodemian, and thus became known, which is based on handed-down knowledge recorded in our annals. Therefore it did not concern a people of a country or state, rather a planets-wide spiritual teaching people, who lived openly and freely around the world in various places and learned and lived the spiritual teaching. Such a people, however, could also be called together for certain purposes at a place, to carry out a particular mission, which Nicodemian did, for example, in order to create peace and unity and to act against aggressors, if the necessity required it. Thus such a spiritual teaching people consisted of human beings of different countries, cultures, and races, who, however, equally concerned themselves with the spiritual teaching, and thus, as spiritual teaching willing ones, formed a people, in which case such a spiritual teaching people effectively represented a multinational people and in no kind and wise was to be compared with an organization, because an effective people existed. In the same sense is also a new people to be understood, which shall be founded, as Quetzal said. And as you, note, Billy, then also mentioned, it is right that such a new spiritual teaching people in its origin should arise through FIGU, and thus in the Nicodemian manner. This says, that according to the words of Quetzal, the core group members of FIGU represent the actual origin of the new people who gathered and began with the work and spreading of the mission. Through continuous new group members and their descendants, as you have said, The new people then shall get together, whereby with that naturally was meant the formation and appearance of the passive members and their descendants. And it just so happened, since the new spiritual teaching people has already begun to form worldwide since 1975, so not only from 1981, and now has a considerable number of spiritual teaching students, that is to say, a small spiritual teaching people, hence the Quetzal words.
A new people must be founded.
Slowly but surely turns into reality.
Which must indeed fulfill itself in such a way, since ancient prophecies are laid out in this wise.
Conclusion: if the human being of earth changes nothing in his, her thoughts, feelings, actions, and deeds to the positive, then an unbearable suffering is certain for him, her, because the above-mentioned sentences of the prophecies will be transformed into absolute fulfilling predictions. The outcoming effects of the terror of the ruling elite dictatorship will be gruesome and for a long time lead to brutal religious terror, foreign governors, Jew-walled ruling, surveillance dictatorship, peoples mixing, war, illness, infirmity, hate, terror, revenge, affliction, hunger, thirst, hardship, brutality, torture and torment, immense environmental damage due to climatic disasters as a result of overpopulation, etc., etc. The human being will then not be able to avoid, sooner or later, voluntarily to join the spiritual teaching people and to turn to the teaching of the truth, teaching of the Spirit, teaching of the life and to the goblet of the truth, to study the teaching, to implement it in life and to evolve in terms of consciousness.
In the goblet of the truth there it says,
Live always in love and in peace, foster freedom and harmony on earth and never forget the real truth. Foster your life always in goodness of heart and live in the true being of the creation. The goblet of the truth will wake you, not to the bane, but to the boon.